that I get it in the recording. Okay, there we go. So before you freak out, don't worry about the final assignment yet until you finish your book report. That is the number one single most important thing. But once you see the prompt for the final, I hopefully you will rest easy a little bit here. I'm going to pull it up real quick just to show you that you don't need to, that you want to take this one thing at a time, first of all. But let me pull it up here in the student view so it doesn't. Here we go, the final paper. It's going to be one question only. Essay format, I'm saying 2-page paper. To what extent did the civil rights movement change the lives of people? It's a complex answer that's required there. So I'm basically going to force you in 2 pages to really focus on one, maybe 2 aspects of the answer to that question, right? It's, 2 pages, double space, 1-inch margins, Times New Roman, all that standard stuff. I'm also saying that you're not required to cite, primarily because I don't want you using any outside material. I want you to just think about the material we've discussed in class and the reading we've done in class. So you can, think about, the Black Power movement, the Black Panther Party, the Chicano movement, anything within the Chicano movement that we talk about, and the indigenous movement, which we'll talk about next week. You can use CAST or anything from the book CAST or any of the themes that come out of that. And so I don't want you to, this is not a research paper. I don't need you doing research outside of what we've talked about in class. However, a few of you, the book you chose for your book report specifically deals with this question. So if it very directly deals with this question and you find something that you just cannot leave it out of this final paper, then by all means include it. But I primarily want you using the stuff that like everybody in class read and everybody in class talked about, as opposed to the outside stuff. I'll be talking more specifically each week in the last few weeks we have left about, these elements and how you can approach this question. But I just wanted to give you a quick preview because I've been getting a lot of questions about what the final will entail. I stopped doing the kind of final exams that I normally did with online teaching because, one, I've never done multiple choice questions. I usually did short answer or essay questions, which I think can better reflect what you've learned. And that's where I can see students expressing what they actually learned or not. But I think a short paper that tackles the subjects we've been dealing in the last few weeks is an appropriate kind of way of wrapping everything up, right? But again, your first task is finishing those book reports, right? How are those going? Good. Okay. I'm like, I was hoping that by extending the deadline, it would give you a little bit of breathing room. I know each week just gets busier and busier. So I was hoping to just at least a little bit of breathing room because I was sensing a lot of tension at the end of last week. And when I get that feeling from several students, that always gives me a hint that it's more widespread than just a few students. I will still accept drafts. Right? I will still accept drafts, or partial drafts or thesis statements. I will accept them over email. Or if you want to meet with me either at office hours or like after class, that would work for me as well. I want to make sure you know that all of that is still in play. And in fact, typically what I do before our papers is due is what I did last week, which is, give you the day before the paper is due off so that hopefully it opens up a little bit of time for people that want to meet with me and for anybody that needs that little tiny bit of wiggle room. So I'm going to do that again this week. I feel like it's appropriate to do that again this week so that we don't have class on Wednesday. Hopefully we'll get through everything today. If not, I'll push whatever needs to be pushed to next week. So no class this Wednesday again. But I will be on the Zoom for anybody that either wants to get the meeting with the professor done or wants to show me a draft or a partial draft. Does that sound all right? Okay. I was like, last week, I was sensing this like huge ball of stress from you all. I was like, let's work on reducing that a tiny little bit, because I'm not just getting it from you all, I'm getting it from my colleagues. They are a ball of stress. And poor staff on campus, I think, are just trying to like, duct tape everything together. Oh, yes, you can absolutely revise. Yes, I did see that one person had submitted it, so you can absolutely resubmit. So I won't grade anything that's submitted yet. I usually hold off anyway until the deadline for everybody. So the system should let you resubmit. But if you have any problem, if anybody has any problem resubmitting, you can let me know. Okay, so thinking about that question for the final paper about to what extent did the civil rights movement change people's lives? One of the things to take into account is, one, how we define the civil rights movement, right? Because what most people think of the civil rights movement, when they think of it, what they're talking about is Martin Luther King's nonviolent protesting, the nonviolent ending segregation part of the civil rights movement. And so it's fair to define it in those very limited terms. But we can also define it in much broader terms, right? And taking into consideration the critiques of the movement that focused on desegregation, because part of what the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers, the Chicano movement, and all these movements that follow is in part a critique and a challenge of the movement to end segregation, because ending ending segregation was very limited, right? That's the critique of the Black Panther Party, is that there was more needed, right? Because they were addressing more than just the issue of segregation. They were addressing police violence, discrimination, when in job applications and housing. They were addressing the issue of lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to food. All of these things were not central to the initial civil rights movement, but they get expanded, right? One of the things that happens, though, that makes that part of the civil rights movement important is that the tactics worked. Even if they worked in a limited sphere, they worked. And they get borrowed, for example, by the Chicano movement, right? So we started talking about the Chicano movement here in 1965 with the grape strike in the San Joaquin Valley, right? And we typically, when we talk about this, the strike and the farm workers organizing and fighting for better wages and better working conditions, we tend to focus on Cesar Chavez, right? But it really is more well-rounded to start with Filipino organizers and Filipino farm workers, because they're really the ones who begin the grape strike. And then as that begins, it ends up being one of the longest strikes in the history of the United States, then how that grows into a farm workers movement, right? Now, farm working conditions had been an issue for a long time. Farm work tends to be low pay and hard physical labor. And the working conditions had always tended to be very poor, especially with the introduction of pesticides. Right? Farm workers often work in the fields. They're bent over all day long, and they're exposed to pesticides all day long with no protections. Right? On top of that, one of the things that was happening here is groups, different ethnic groups were being pitted against one another to lower wages. Right? So the Filipinos would be working in the grape fields in the San Joaquin Valley, for example, and the bosses would often threaten, hey, you want more pay? I don't have to pay you more. I can just fire you and hire a Mexican immigrant to do this job, and they'll do it happily for the price that I'm offering you. Things like that. And then they would say the same to Mexicans and Mexican Americans, and that way keeping the wages low, right? So it was something that was a strategy by bosses in the agricultural field. The other issue was long working hours, and like I said, working conditions. So having no protection for the pesticides, having no real tools given to them, no kind of safety involved in there. So these are the things that Filipinos are organizing for. And the key organization at the time was the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, AWOC, which was specifically a Filipino labor organization. There at the time, they are trying to work with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, but they're having a hard time with it, right? At the time, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta had been organizing the National Farm Workers Association, right? And the National Farm Workers Association, notice it's not a union, it was an association. So when it was first founded, it really struggled to really bring people together, because they could always find people to hear the message and want to be part of it. So people would sign up, and then they would go to the meetings, and they might go to one meeting and then never again. And so the membership of the National Farm Workers Association was constantly growing and diminishing, and it was a struggle. So Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta spent years trying to build the National Farm Workers Association, and really going very slowly at first. They were also very inspired by nonviolent direct action tactics. And so they, in order to do that, in order to try to be effective, they felt like they had to be careful and strategic about every move, right? And so Cesar Chavez did not want to immediately join the grape strike, but the Filipino farm workers in September just said, we're going to do it. So they did. The Filipino farm workers went on strike in September of 1965, but they couldn't do it alone, right? And this is part of the problem with any kind of minority group in the United States trying to achieve any change, right? By definition, minority groups are a minority. And so they always need to form coalition and alliances with other groups in order to be more effective. And the Filipino organizers knew that. They knew that. So they are the whole time in contact with Cesar Chavez and the National Farm Workers Association, trying to get them to commit to striking with them, right? To commit to support, because that's really, in order for a strike to work or a boycott to work, it has to be long lasting, people have to be committed, and it has to be widespread. It's the key factors in making a strike or a boycott work. That's what had happened, what they had seen happen with the Montgomery bus boycott, right? That was a huge inspiration here for farm workers. Was, hey, it can take months, right? It can take a year plus to really achieve what we're looking for. And so you have to get everybody committed, right? Filipinos were ready, and they go ahead without the support of Cesar Chavez. But the National Farm Workers Association has a meeting, and they call to vote whether they're going to support the Filipino farm workers or not. And the membership of the National Farm Workers Association votes to support the strike. So in that way, then it's the Filipino farm workers and the membership of the National Farm Workers Association itself that forced Cesar Chavez to finally join the strike. And it's in the grape strike in San Joaquin Valley that Cesar Chavez will become a national figure, right? It's going to get the attention that they want and that they need to make this a successful strike. It will get Cesar Chavez a lot of notoriety. Students joined in support of the farm workers. SNCC specifically, they sent people when they were marching. There's at one point a march from the San Joaquin Valley up to Sacramento, and SNCC joined in. They were also very vocally in support of the farm workers. And the Congress of Racial Equality also was also part of the strike. There were also representatives from the indigenous movement present at the marches and in support of the farm workers. So it does end up being a kind of coalition building moment, right? Where it's just not Filipinos, it's not just Latino farm workers, not just farm workers. It's something that gets the attention of other groups that were fighting very similar fights, right? That's the thing that brought everybody together, that what they were fighting is the same kind of power structures, right? And that's something that is different, right? That's coming out in the late 60s and 70s, was activists recognizing that problems are more than just individual, right? The problem's not just segregation in the American South. The problem is whole systems of inequality, right? It's the criminal justice system. It's the way the economy is organized, right? And so in order to effect bigger changes, you had to just fight things at a kind of larger scale. And they can do that. One of the things we see with the grape strike is they can do that when people are working together and building relationships across racial, ethnic, and movements. Right? So, all these different groups join in the strike and in support, but then they also start calling for a boycott, asking Americans not to buy grapes. Right? They want a national boycott because this might send an even bigger message to the companies. But how do you convince Americans not to buy grapes? As it is, right? Even today, right? If you're going to call for boycotting of something, you have to be able to explain to the public why you're boycotting something and make it something that is feasible and something that people are actually going to back. So for this, they needed more than just the farm workers, right? Tell them they are bad. Yeah, but remember there was a history of strikes in the labor movement during the 19th century and of strikes being very effective. But here you're talking about a staple that people have in their kitchens, right? Something they go to the grocery store for, and that, you know, when we're buying groceries at the grocery store, most of the time we're not thinking about the people that that harvested, that worked in the fields, making these products happen. And in order to get people to join, you kind of had to explain all of this to people, explain the conditions, right? I mean, even living in Southern California, unless you live right by the fields, you're not even seeing how things get grown, how they get picked. I grew up in Ventura County and up in Oxnard, and so there were always strawberry fields and orange trees and like all this other agricultural economy there. And still, I was not always thinking about it, right? So it's really easy to just like put it off your mind. And that was a big hurdle for the farm workers. But one of the things that happens is that with students and a lot of clergy joining in support of the strikers, it's students, it's people with more education, right? That can go on TV, sound really articulate, know what they're talking about, that can make their case to the American public, right? In a way that reaches people and in a way that farm workers can't always necessarily do. They also had to contend with imports. Yeah, all right, exactly. So I'm like, and this is why the boycott had to be like complete, right? Because you can always bring in grapes from somewhere else. But you had to tell people why you can't buy any grapes, not just from the companies that for where the workers are on strike, but you can't buy grapes, period. Because if you end up buying grapes that are being imported from somewhere else, you're going to hurt the strikers, right? So, and that's where the students and clergy, a lot of which already had experience by 1965, as talking to as part of the Martin Luther King's organizations and other organizations fighting to end segregation, because they have kind of that experience, and they can go on TV or in newspapers, give interviews, and lay out things in a way that makes sense to the American public. And that was a huge element to help make the grape strike successful. Right? At the same time, but at this point in 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. One, he supports the grape strikes, the strike and the boycott here, but he had also begun shifting his message. In his speeches, he's talking at this point about more than just ending segregation, right? The Voting Rights Act had been passed, the Civil Rights Act had been passed, and so he'd begun this attack on the issue of poverty, right? And his understanding of what needed to change in the United States had grown into an economic message, right? And so for him, supporting the grape strike in the San Joaquin Valley was part of an attack on poverty. Right? If poverty is one of the central problems that communities face, and how do you fix it? Well, one of the ways was by demanding higher wages and working together, right? So that racist attitudes could be challenged and combated and hopefully changed. But the big thing was that attack on poverty, right? He was even talking about how needing to change a capitalist economic system. Right? By the time we get to 1965, in his speeches, there is a messaging that is anti-capitalist. Right? Yes, and this is something that he'd begun to really bring in. It made sense as like the next kind of intellectual step in the way he was tackling it, because he could see you could end segregation, but still the lives of individuals significantly changing with the end of legal segregation. Right? That's part of why I asked that question in the final exam, because it doesn't end racism, right? And even in trying to end segregation, the fact that you had to bring in the National Guard and get the federal government involved to force Southern state and local governments to adhere to the law, right, was such a struggle. So he joined in support. He started a correspondence with Cesar Chavez, where he told Cesar Chavez, like, what you're doing is important, and congratulations, and I'm supportive of you, all of that stuff. So it's the beginning here of something more, because the National Farm Workers Association will become the United Farm Workers of America. Right? Eventually, the strike is also successful. Right? They get an increase in pay. Workers got an increase in pay, and they got improved working conditions. Right? So it took years to get everything that the farm workers were asking for, but they were able to eventually get what they had been fighting for there. And so Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta both started the United Farm Workers of America, and they saw the need to go beyond the grape strike, right? And fighting for farm workers to have, one, bathroom breaks, right? Because oftentimes farm workers, even today, getting breaks to go to the bathroom is a struggle. Yeah, hold on, actually, Mary, thank you for saying that. Let me double check my audio settings, because sometimes the audio just like, yeah, see this is what happened here. Thank you, Mary, for saying something, because sometimes the audio settings just get changed on me and then there's no notification, no nothing. They just change the audio settings on me with no notice. That sounds better, right? Now I'm super loud. Okay, let me change it again. Oof. I'm like, I also don't want to hurt your ears. How is this? Okay. Thank you. I'm like, eventually we'll get it right. Okay, so bathroom breaks. Bathroom breaks are still an issue for farm workers, right? Having a lunch break, right? Getting that. So now farm workers get lunch breaks, but that was not something that farm workers had in 1965. The 8-hour workday. Typically, and especially because of some of the demands of just the growing season, a lot of times people had longer working hours. Jared, tons of disease outbreaks because of the bathroom breakage situation. Yes, the issue of diseases was a big deal. In part because, so I'm like, I'm going to get into this with the, for me, it's encompassed under a living wage, but also living conditions. So the bathroom breaks created health problems. The exposure to pesticides created a ton of health issues. All of a sudden, people that had never had certain respiratory and skin issues were having them. There's an outbreak of cancer amongst farm workers that it's hard to prove a direct link to pesticides, but it's very obvious when people hadn't had these cases of cancer at such high rates, and then they begin having them, and so becomes a huge problem. And the pesticide issue, it's still a big deal, by the way. When you see like farm workers, when they wear, like they're covering their faces, they're trying to prevent inhaling the amount of pesticides that they typically do. But still, those aren't enough protections, right? Like wearing a mask is not enough to prevent pesticide from being inhaled and from getting on you. So that's still an issue. On top of it, living conditions. What you typically have is companies providing housing for farm workers because it's seasonal work. It's not year round. And oftentimes you're in rural communities. And so what the companies did is set up housing. Housing might be a bit of a generous term to use here. There were these like buildings that were poor quality, built really quickly, tended to be small and house a large number of people, with oftentimes not even access to sewage and running water and food. And it's all being provided by the company, but it's very poor quality. And as a result, then you also had outbreaks of disease and health issues in the farm worker housing. And on top of it, no access to healthcare. Very limited access to healthcare. And even despite those kinds of working conditions, right, it was still hard to get people to agree to go on a strike, right? Why do you think it was so hard to get people to go on strike? Because you can't afford not to work. You're getting paid, at that point below minimum wage. There's getting paid very little. But when you depend so much on the little bit that you're getting paid, one day off, but it's a big deal. But here we were talking about weeks and potentially months or longer of having or striking. In the meantime, how are you going to feed your family? And this is something that all unions everywhere have to overcome, that fear. And usually that's why the union usually will organize unions with the funding for it, will pay a small stipend for strikers while they're on strikes. and the fear of losing your job, right? Yes, because you can't just easily move especially if it's a more widespread strike. On top of it, your housing depends on that company that's hiring you. So even though it's poor quality and terrible, you're going to lose the only place where you have a roof over your head while you're on strike, because they'll just fire you and remove you from the premises. What do you do then? What do you do, especially if you have children, if you have elderly people that you're taking care of? It's a huge problem, and these are kind of bigger hurdles that always have to be overcome whenever you're trying to unionize or organize a strike. There's especially had already been a history throughout the 30s and 40s and even into the 50s of people being really reluctant to go out on strike. There were cases of deportation of American citizens, right, during the 30s and 40s, where farm workers, even though they'd been born in the United States, were deported to Mexico, right? And how do you fight that? Well, it's very difficult. Was the scare of communism a factor? So it would still have been a factor in terms of public opinion, mostly. When it came to farm workers, part of the problem with it was most people didn't, and probably still don't, understand what communism was, right? So it would have been a factor, but at that point in 1965, a smaller factor. The bigger problem with communism was how you pitched a strike to the American public in a way that didn't sound like what you are advocating for was communism. Yes, especially if you're undocumented, right? And a large portion of farm workers still are undocumented. And so that fear of what's going to happen, right? If you go on strike, was a huge, huge hurdle. Okay? In fact, I've always, as a young person, I always idolized Cesar Chavez and even Dolores Huerta. And when you learn a little bit more about them, some of the things that they said about immigration, I think a lot of people would not, a lot of people in the immigrant community would not like. Cesar Chavez was against immigration. He won because undocumented farm workers were less likely to go on strike, to want to be part of the union. And he believed that undocumented people who helped keep the wages of farm workers low. So he was against immigration. He was against immigration and often had very harsh things to say about immigrants. So this is kind of two topics that should not be conflated, right? For him, it was his central focus was the conditions of farm workers, but to him that did not equal advocating for immigrant rights. He was not pro immigrants in that sense. Yes, he was a citizen. And most Chicanos shared the same sentiments. Yeah, during that era. Yeah, this was not an uncommon. This did not make him problematic at the time. It makes him more problematic now in some communities, but at the time that was not. This was most people did not disagree with that. Dolores Huerta now, it's really interesting to see how she has changed. She's now has a lot of political capital and political power, because I used to live in a swing district a few elections ago. The district, they were having trouble with Latino turnout to vote. They were seeing very few Latinos in the district saying that they were going to go vote. And the Democrats really wanted the Latino vote to turn out. One of the things they did is they brought in Dolores Huerta to campaign in that district. She doesn't live in the district or anything like that, but she gave the candidate up there, quotes, and was up there campaigning at the rallies and at things like that. And I see how oftentimes whenever they're trying to rally the Latino vote, oftentimes they use people with Dolores Huerta who have a lot of credibility and a lot of capital within the Latino community to urge them to come out and vote for particular candidates. And some people were really upset with her because more recently, she was very vocal anti-Bernie Sanders. She was supported Hillary Clinton in that Democratic primary. And I know a lot of people really became very disillusioned with her choices of political candidates to support. Just as an interesting sign. It's always really interesting when these people have longer lives and all of your heroes, if they live long enough, at some point disappoint you. So, but just to, I'm like, I always try to not view some of these people as just pure heroes and view them as complicated people, right? Whether we like them or not. Either way, people are always complex, right? And as we all are. So out of the farm, so then the farm worker movement is growing and gaining support and is able to do more. Within that, Mexican American identity becomes really important because the majority of Latinos in Southern California and in the US were Mexican American. Right. There were a lot of Puerto Ricans that worked in who were farm workers at the time, right? We already said Mexican American, Filipino, Black farm workers, and Puerto Ricans. Those made some of the bigger groups working in the fields. But Mexican American identity becomes a central kind of unifying force for the Chicano movement. Right? And it's primarily coming out of California and the American Southwest, where it makes sense then that the central identity would be Mexican American identity. And this new generation of activists that make up the Chicano movement are rejecting assimilation. Right? And this was highly controversial because even at the time in the 60s and the 70s, there was a lot of pressure for immigrants coming in to assimilate, right? People at the time would talk about how they were afraid of speaking Spanish in public, right? And so people would kind of felt forced to learn, not just learn English, but speak only in English. And that's why now, by the way, second, third generation Mexican Americans don't speak Spanish, right? And a lot of it has to do with that generation having felt like if they spoke Spanish in public, that they would be they would stand out. They would stand out and would be subject to violence and discrimination. And so people just opted to assimilate as much as possible and not stand out as different. But for, let's see, what are you guys saying? So I'm like, I know this is common in our communities. Right, I'm like, yes, exactly. I'm like, a lot of you all are a product of that. Alberto says, during my elementary school days, we as students were strongly discouraged because that's the other factor, the pressure in schools. We'll get to that in a second. I already can't speak Spanish to save my life. Fortunately, I think now the discourse has changed. And even now, it's not even, for some time, there was a pressure of like, wait a minute. You're Mexican American, what do you mean? Do you speak Spanish? Because if you don't, then you're a bad Mexican American. But now I think things have shifted to have a wider understanding of how identities have been shaped, and that, you know, who qualifies as a member of different groups is more than just language and how you look, right? So, and a lot of that comes out of some of these younger activists who were rejecting assimilation and trying to maintain as much of that Mexican heritage as possible. And in trying to do that, one of the focus was emphasizing Mexican history and Mexican American history, right? So emphasizing the Mexican American War, right? Talking about how all of this American Southwest territory used to be Mexico, right? Phrases like "I didn't cross the border crossed us," right? This idea, emphasizing this idea that this was Mexican land before, and the border shifted and left a lot of people in this kind of cultural limbo. And so a lot of emphasis on that history and the history of Mexican Americans kind of being discriminated against is emphasized within the Chicano movement, but also trying to reclaim indigenous and African roots, right? Indigenous from Mexico particularly, right? But also the kind of mixture of indigenous, African, and European groups in Mexico. Mary says, my parents wanted to learn English and would tell my siblings and I to speak English. And I do not speak Spanish as well as I should, but my parents speak English in a very, very heavy accent. Yeah. And it's interesting because it was people who, learned English as a second language, have a heavy accent, but were refusing to speak Spanish and teaching their children to only learn English. And it was out of that pressure of assimilating and trying to make sure, right, that their children were better assimilated and could have, therefore, an easier life. Yeah. Albert says differences were very marked between California, Arizona, Texas, New Mexico. Yeah. And anybody if you've ever been to any of those places, it's very obvious right away. I'm like, my example is always Tex-Mex. Do you all like Tex-Mex? Have you tried? I'm like, have you tried Tex-Mex? I think the Tex-Mex I tried was one of the worst ever. So I'm like, the Tejanos have a very particular culture there. And I'm like, those Mexican American Texans are very different than Mexican Americans in California, or like you said, New Mexico, Arizona. My other experiences with Mexican Americans in Arizona. You've never tried Tex-Mex? I don't recommend it. I'm like, I didn't like it because it's Mexican food with this weird twist that feels very fake. Yeah. But that's my own bias too, I should say, because having grown up in California, but also like in a Mexican household where we ate Mexican food. And now we're gonna just have a let's bash Tex-Mex session, which I'm here for. Taco Bell. Oh yeah, my significant other knows that the best way to piss me off is to tell me he wants Mexican food from Taco Bell. He does it to push my buttons. He knows that's not Mexican food. But back to this, indigenous roots, and trying to embrace indigenous roots from Mexican Americans and African roots is very tricky. In large part because for a lot of Mexican Americans, there might not be a direct way of figuring out which indigenous community you can trace your lineage back to, especially if you're not going back to Mexico on a regular basis, if you don't have family back there and there's not a family history that the family has passed down, which is very common because the emphasis in a lot of places in Latin America and in Mexico, the emphasis for a long time was on the importance of being mestizo, of being mixed, of this idea of like, oh, everybody in Mexico is mixed European, probably Spanish and indigenous. right? When in reality, Mexico is one much more diverse. There were significant African communities in Mexico, and one of the first slaves ever to be brought to the Americas actually went to Mexico. But regardless, difficult. So what a lot of Mexican American activists did at the time in the 60s and the 70s was emphasize Aztec folklore. Right? So that's why a lot of times in the murals, this is still around today, right? In the murals, in the art, Mexican American art in Los Angeles and in Southern California has a lot of Aztec iconography and Aztec themes, right? The imagery of the eagle is in part because the eagle is an important symbol within Aztec iconography. Right? There's the whole myth of the founding of the Aztecs, right? Is this eagle eating the serpent, which is the symbol in the Mexican flag. But a lot of Mexican Americans like to connect to that history, whether or not they can trace their roots back to the Aztecs, because of that idea of a great empire, right? And the greatness of the Aztec Empire being destroyed by the Spanish colonizers, right? It creates a story, a myth, that you can trace back to, and there's information on, right? Because we have plenty of information on the Aztecs and that history. And then it just was adopted by Mexican Americans as part of their iconography and their history, right? I had this friend who was really into the Aztec connection. She thought of herself as like an Aztec princess. And I had no problem with it. But thinking back, I'm like, she's from Jalisco. I was like, I wonder what indigenous group was over there, because I'm not sure it was the Aztecs. But it doesn't matter, right? For a lot of Mexican Americans, it doesn't matter if you can actually find that trace back to the Aztecs. It becomes emblematic of some sort of indigenous history that you feel connected to. And Aztlan becomes an important moment. The capital of the Aztec Empire becomes this important symbol. And that's why the word ends up being used in a lot of Mexican American organizations and a lot of the artwork. So there's this emphasis on trying to recuperate, right, and build a distinctly Mexican American identity. Right? That I think has shifted to some extent. Well, I don't know. Let me ask you: do you think there's still an emphasis on a Mexican American identity now, especially in California, since that's where, for most of us, that's our experiences? Or have you seen any shifts in the way, especially a younger generation, how they connect back to a history or a culture? Oh, see, Brian says, funny story. My dad is Mexican, but he gets tired of eating it like every day. So when he was younger, as a truck driver along the Southwest, he was introduced to Tex-Mex and loves Americanized Mexican food like asada, asada fries, one of my biggest pet peeves, Frito pie and nachos. Yeah, no, and that totally makes sense. So we should not bash Tex-Mex food in front of your dad. Albert, the Aztec princess held up by the Aztec warrior in the famous Panaderia calendars was modeled after Esther Williams, the American 1946. And that's a huge, really important symbol. The Aztec warrior holding the Aztec princess in his arms, it's still in every cobija you find. Right, there's the horses and the different animals and the different blankets, but I'm like, I still have my old cobija with the Aztec warrior holding the Aztec princess in his arms. Is just, again, how that iconography has become very important, and a lot of it was through this Mexican American emphasis. Yeah, you have that painting. The image is not particularly feminist, but it's beautiful. Ricardo says there's definitely a shift in identity, mostly focusing on embracing and reconnecting with the indigenous roots. For a long time, it's mostly been centered around Mexica, but there are more groups in Mexico that people can trace their indigenous roots to. Yes. And trying to reconnect, really trying to figure out now there's more of an emphasis on that. Yeah. I used to have a calendar with the same picture. That was a long time ago. The calendars, yes, from all the panaderias, or every Mexican business always puts out a calendar every year. A great La Llorona, yes. All these little stories, right? And the way that the story of La Llorona, right? Basically every region in Mexico and every family almost has a different version of these stories. And then in the US, that story gets, passed down and recreated with these different Mexican-American twists. El Coco or El Cucuy or whatever, he gets called all kinds of different things depending on where you're from. Yeah. Yeah. What was I was going to add something too. Oh, the DNA test, Mary says, yes. That's one way in which people can actually find out, or actually doing family histories, trying to dig back which particular indigenous group people come from. There's also, I think, amongst the Latinx community, kind of more globally, the Latinx diaspora, and also in the US, of moving beyond that Mexican American identity to recognize kind of the wider Latin American connections, right? Especially as immigration from different parts of Latin America has increased, right? Because Mexican immigration kind of ebbs and flows until today. So at times, right, there's Latino communities in the US are made up of more than just Mexican and Mexican American folk. One of the things I've seen lately is kind of an emphasis more on trying to celebrate all those different nationalities. Right? Okay, we're not all Mexican American, right? So let's emphasize, all right, there's food from, Guatemala, from Argentina, from all these other places that gets more recognition as people come to understand the diversity within Latin America, right? That's the same way I felt the first time I heard the term Latinx. I was like, don't give me another term. I already have to fight or, figure out whether I'm Hispanic, Latina, Mexican American, or one of those. And I was like, now you're going to throw another term at me. But it is now one within scholarship, the word that gets used. So I go on and off between using it and not. But okay. An even more radical section of the Chicano movement we see in individuals like Reyes Lopez Tijerina. He was nicknamed King Tiger, or also sometimes described as the Malcolm X of the Chicano movement. His emphasis was on land reclamation, right? Reclaiming land that was taken from Mexican Americans after the Mexican American War in particular, right? And by doing that, by occupying the land, like organizing people to go into places and just like basically forcing local authorities to remove them or to give back the land. Right. He also organized a lot of protests and armed raids in New Mexico. So that New Mexico was one of the places where he lived and where his activism was centered. So in a lot of ways, more radical tactics than the farm workers movement, right? I mean, just by some of these bullet points, what is he sounding more like? Mary says, Columbus. I just discovered this land, yeah. But for people like Lopez Tijerina, I think his inspiration was more from one indigenous movements in terms of trying to focus on, return of the land, but also more radical tactics like those used by groups like the Black Panthers and other groups within the Black Power movement, of saying, okay, this is not a passive, nonviolent tactic, right? He was trying to use things that would, one, get public attention and get media attention, right? So like occupying land would oftentimes get a lot of attention and raise awareness then to the fact that a lot of Mexican Americans had had land taken from them after the Mexican American War, land that the US had supposedly guaranteed, right? In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, they had guaranteed would not be taken from people. I also want to emphasize the other big thing for the Chicano movement was bilingual education, right? Bilingual education, because most teachers in the LA County Unified District were white and did not speak Spanish. And they would oftentimes treat their students with racism, forcing them to not speak Spanish. Not offering them the same kind of opportunities that white students had, right? Calling them names, right? And not teaching any Latino history. And so it was because of activists that, one, they forced the hand of a lot of school districts to hire more Latino teachers. Right. At Cal State LA, it's because of activists that we're one of the few universities in the United States, by the way, to have a Chicano-Chicana studies program, to have an Asian American studies program, and to have an African American studies program. Right? Some universities, especially in certain parts, might have one or two of those. But it is very rare to have a university that offers all three of those ethnic studies disciplines, and to offer majors and minors in it. And a lot of it came from student protesters in the 60s demanding that happen. Right? But this was happening at all levels of education, right? And the K through 12 education, this was a huge problem, the racism of teachers towards Latino students. And so students would organize things like the very famous 1968 student walkouts, where students just walked out, right? Walked out with signs and protesting and demanding that the education system take into account the Latino population, right? Teach the history, and it wasn't just about, oh, you need to teach Mexican history. No, it's teach Mexican American history, teach about the Mexican American War, teach about the racism experienced by these communities over the course of these decades, right? And it was actually, young kids that begun all of this organizing around education, and it also kind of ended up happening at the higher education university level. So it's really amazing. Did any of you go to any of the presentations or talks that occurred? When was it now? Was it last year now or a couple of years ago to commemorate the student walkouts in 1968? No, we had a display, like an art gallery. They invited several speakers because most of these people, are still alive, people that walked out and were protesting and were heavily kind of activated, right? They became interested in this. They became activists during this period, fighting for things that now are normal part of our educational system. No. All right. Well, I wanted to at least make sure and emphasize that because it has shaped our school to such a significant extent, and makes us unique even even when comparing Cal State LA to a lot of the more prestigious universities, so that a lot of them don't have the kind of education we have. Albert went to a few of those talks. Yeah. Did you want to add anything, having heard some of those talks?
Well, what I assisted was mainly talking about art during the 60s, 70s, and OSCO, Harry Gamboa Jr. and Patsy Valdez and all them speaking about the protest of Chicanos not having art space and in direct correlation with the Chicano moratorium. So it was pretty interesting on how self-help graphics help push some of these changes within schools through art and art community.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm like all these different aspects of it is super interesting. I also wanted at least briefly touch on the Brown Berets, which were founded by David Sanchez and Carlos Montes, because one, this was originally Young Chicanos for Community Action in Monterey Park was the initial organization, and they end up turning here into the Brown Berets. What the topics they were focused on were police brutality, right? And how it affected not just the Black community, but the Latino community. Oops, did I go too far? So this was a big element of, they were looking at the way in which the Black Panthers and other Black groups had been organizing around the topic of police brutality. And because the Latino community was also heavily affected by it, right? This was one of the central themes for a lot of kind of more radical Chicano groups. They look like a bunch of Che Guevara clones, Nathan says. Yeah, so apparently it started because one of the organizers just randomly, like he happened to have bought a brown beret. It was just like this random thing. He bought a brown beret. He started wearing it. As he started wearing it and other people started wearing it, and it became a thing. The thing that identified people in the group was the wearing of the brown berets. And yeah, for a lot of them, Che Guevara would have been a heavy influence and a heavy inspiration. Yeah. They were also very interested. They were fighting for better education for Latinos, and the discrimination experienced by the Latino community. They were also, because the focus was community-based, they were also trying to organized rather, El Barrio free clinics within Latino communities. So a lot like the Black Panther clinics, and though probably at a smaller scale, but very similar to that. So what a lot of these activists were finding is that the problems within low-income communities, which tended to be Black, Latino, Asian American, were the same, right? One of the big problems being identified here is lack of access to healthcare. Right? So how do you fix that? How do you tackle that? Well, instead of kind of finding the task overwhelming, what a lot of these young people were doing was, all right, let's organize this at a community level ourselves, right? We can't depend on the government to bring this help to us to fill this need. So instead, we're going to organize it ourselves. That's really difficult because it depends on the community coming together around the cause. So when you need people that can reach out to nurses and doctors, and nurses and doctors have to be willing to volunteer their time for some of these clinics because they're going to be offering their services for free or for very low pay. Right? Because you can't have community paying a lot for these services. So people are probably going to be, the ideal, the standard was to offer it for free. And to have the physical space for a clinic, right? So oftentimes you're relying on community centers, churches, or just anybody in the community that might have access to a building, a room, anything that where a doctor or nurse can come in and offer some sort of regular service to the community. Right. On top of that, because a lot of members of the community were probably going to need things like tests, blood tests, vaccines, x-rays, things like that, then you need equipment, right? And so what a lot of activists were doing was, one, maybe somebody within the group or the organization might have a contact with a company, might work for a pharmaceutical company or a tech company that had access to that, or you had to reach out to the companies and ask for donations, right? And there were companies willing to do that for the Brown Berets, for the Black Panthers, that they were willing to donate some of that, but you had to reach out, build a relationship with those communities and not be overwhelmed by the task of it, right? These were a problem for the American government because a lot of them, if it was truly community-based, then the federal government doesn't have control over them, right? Like that was the big problem with the Black Panther clinics was, and so they were oftentimes targeted also by local police for whatever infraction they could find, right? They were always coming in trying to raid the clinic, and even if they couldn't find any violation within some of these community clinics, sometimes they would, in their searches, the police would break the equipment and then destroy facilities in a way that meant that you couldn't keep offering care for people. So lots of layers here. So let me stop for a second and ask you, all right, because I call this the Chicano movement, and I've been talking about different factors of what made up the Chicano movement in the 60s and 70s. But what does it mean? What does that word mean? What does it mean to be a Chicano?
Chicana?
Yeah.
Like someone in America with Mexican descent, or a female specifically for Chicana.
For Chicanas.
Of Mexican
But
descent.
yeah, we can say Chicano or Chicana. Yeah. So, and hence the Mexican American identity aspect of it, right? Yeah. What else? I'm not just asking you, Rory, I'm asking everybody, but if you want to add something else. Ricardo, yeah?
Is it also a political term for identification within the United States as a Mexican descendant?
Yes, and that's exactly what Ricardo is saying in the chat. The word implies political activism, since that's how the word came about. Yes, notice how this all involves doing something, fighting for something, whether it's participating in the walkouts, striking, membership within one of these organizations. It implies a particular kind of political activism and at the very minimum, political awareness, right? So typically people who call themselves Chicano or Chicana are not just sitting back and doing something. It typically implies a political, at minimum, some kind of political ideology. Yeah, and Nathan said,
Can you hear me?
yes.
Okay, no, because my microphone wasn't working earlier. But basically, to me, like Chicano or Chicana is basically somebody that was born here and they have their heritage is from Mexico. But the thing is that they're a little bit more Americanized, I guess I would say. And it's just like you're more more rebellious, I guess. That's how I would see it. And I when growing up, I was always my parents would take us to places like our heritage and everything. And even like the Chicano part, I seen it when the murals were almost dispainted, discolored, and I seen it come back to life. I didn't even talk to some of the artists there and everything. So I have a strong connection to that part. But growing up, it was just we're always go to little Mexican fiestas and todo. But I was like, no, I'm Latina. I'm not Chicana, because I didn't feel like I was being a little rebel, to earn that title.
Yeah,
Like,
and that is actually, and this is where a lot of Latinos, especially from younger generations and that generation, kind of struggle with, okay, well, then which word am I going to use to define myself? Because that word becomes really important within the Latino community or within the Southern California communities. Yeah, and it's why I'm like, I love hearing you all. By the way, I'm like, I don't think I could get this kind of conversation in any other university, almost, but because I'm like, I always struggled with those words. I spent years thinking of, okay, which word am I going to use? Yeah,
no,
Rory?
oh,
Or,
Oh, do you want to go, Mary? You can go first.
no, and one just last thing, because to me it was like I would always see like the older generations, like whenever we'd go to these events and even anything, like I would see the older people like, oh, I'm Chicana, and like they were like say it very proudly, like, and to me it was just like, oh, you earned that title, you're older, you know, it's just like that's your title. And that's how I would see it. And so like to me, I was like, oh, I'm just Latina. Like I don't earn that title yet. I don't, you know, it's not my badge to wear. But like now I'm like, okay, I'm Latina, you know, I could say I'm Chicana, whatever. But now with the whole Latinx, I'm like, I don't know what the fuck I am. But sorry, just kidding.
no, it's fine. Rory?
I think I always use Chicana more just because through my mom, I'm like fourth or fifth generation American. Like
Yeah.
they've been here that long. So it's kind of like I don't really feel right using Latina just because I am so far removed from like having been in Mexico.
Yeah.
It just doesn't feel right to use for me specifically. And my mom grew up in Boyle Heights and she always used Chicana because that's how she
That's
identified with it most.
Yeah.
So it just, I don't know. It's
No,
kind of confusing. I agree, Mary. I don't know what the fuck I am anymore.
No, you keep with what you've already found. And some of that's the same thing that you're bringing up in the chat. And some of it was, I mean, it was all connected to anti-Vietnam War activism, Albert. Yeah. I'm going to have to stop in 30 seconds, but I'm like, do you all see now